We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Seminar on making finance ministries part of the push for net zero emissions. This event is hosted by the Center for Global Development in partnership with Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at London School of Economics and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. My name is Sanjeev Gupta. I'm a Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Center for Global Development. Climate change is happening faster than previously expected. There is an urgent need to transfer our economies through investing in net zero, adaptation, resilience, and natural capital. This economic transition will entail a large-scale investment globally, a significant proportion of which will have to come from public finances. This means that finance ministers have a wide-ranging power and influence to help lead the push toward net zero and green transition. In today's seminar, we will discuss a new guide developed by a coalition of finance ministers for climate action to help finance ministries mainstream climate into their core functions, as well as the changes that are needed in ministries of finance to strengthen their capabilities. We'll begin the seminar with short introductory remarks by Mesita Kristalin, who is a special advisor to Minister of Finance of Indonesia. Mesita is Sherpa for the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, where the Indonesia's finance minister serves as a co-chair together with Dutch finance minister. Mesita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Distinguished speakers, guests, panelists, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. First and foremost, I would like to extend my gratitude to the Center for Global Development for making today's event possible in order to introduce one of our proud work from Guide to Action, Enhancing the Influence of Finance Ministries in Advancing Climate Initiative. I also would like to thank the HP2 countries, the main countries that are working really hard on this report, and our partner from GRI, Nick Godfrey, Annika Helkwolf, and also Amar here. As soon as we published the guide publicly during the last spring meeting in DC, it has been in our timeline to share this work widely to the world. Starting from the coalition members consisting of 88 finance ministers, now 89 last week, and 26 institutional partners. Our goal is to support finance ministries around the globe to unlock their potential and capabilities in order to drive climate action. Action here being emphasis because ministries of finance are usually the interlocutor in a country within climate policies from financing, fiscal policy, and implementation. We believe that finance ministries have their own strength in yielding a double dividend. The finance ministry can push not only home country to meet the net zero emission, but also could accelerate the developmental objectives. A more comprehensive explanation of the guide will be presented by later by Nick and also Annika. But before, allow me to highlight that the guide consists of an extraordinary array of concrete policy steps for the finance ministers, not only to strengthen their engagement in climate action, but also in catalyzing a just and green transition. Acknowledging the complexity of climate change as a multifaceted challenge, it becomes apparent that many finance ministers lack the necessary technical expertise to effectively implement the provided guide. Therefore, we at the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Actions, we try to extend beyond the only provision of the guide, but also focusing on enhancing and also expanding the capabilities of our members to drive climate actions with the guide. This objective is pursued through three primary approaches. First, we at the coalition facilitate peer-to-peer exchange among members and also institutional partners. Therefore, we can foster knowledge sharing and also collaboration. Secondly, capacity building programs proposed by institutional partners are implemented to enhance the skill and competencies of finance ministers and also to allow exchange of information going back and forth from the IPs and the member countries. Lastly, the coalition, in conjunction with the World Bank, we just carries out a program we call C3A, Capacity Creation for Climate Action Program. This is a grassroots initiative aimed at empowering and enabling action at the local level. And it's actually demand driven, so demanded by the finance ministers what type of support they actually need. By adopting these comprehensive strategies outlined in the report, the coalition strives to support finance ministries in effectively addressing climate change and its associated challenge. I hope today's event will bring us into a greater place of knowledge. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm giving back the time to Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Masita, for your very helpful introductory remarks. We will now proceed with a brief presentation on the guide jointly by Nick Godfrey and Anika Heckford. Nick is a senior advisor and senior visiting fellow at Grantham Research Institute, and Anika is a policy analyst at Grantham Research Institute. Nick and Anika, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Indeed. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Just want to start with a quick thank you to you, Sanjeev, and to CGD for hosting this event and for your leadership in helping shape this guide. Alongside many other organizations and partners, Masita, Pekka, your leadership has been fundamental. David, Sam, World Bank and IMF, thank you for your leadership. This has been a truly collaborative effort. There's much more detail included in the guide, but Anika and I are going to attempt now to give you an overview of what's included. And hopefully you'll see some slides on your screen. First thing to say is that in our view, historically speaking, the role of finance ministries has been very much underappreciated in the climate action landscape. So what I'm going to do is start with saying something about why, in our view, finance ministries are so important for driving climate action and economic transformation at speed and scale. Second, Anika is going to give an overview of the flagship guide, its framework for climate action. And then finally, I'll conclude with some lessons learned from our engagement and work with finance ministries over the last 18 months or so as coordinators of this effort. Next slide, please. Fantastic. I'll start just by saying that we know globally that we're far off track in terms of climate. We need to see a close to 50% reduction in global carbon emissions by the end of this decade, and we're on track for around about a 10% increase in emissions by the end of this decade. So we need to move very, very quickly to rapidly transform global emissions. I just want to start by saying something about the context and purpose of this guide. So the guide has been very much designed to help shape the debate around the future role and mandates of ministries of finance. And indeed, it's designed to showcase real examples and positive examples of leadership by ministries of finance globally. And in our view, there's been a lot of attention around the costs and risks of climate action, but an insufficient discourse on the net benefits and opportunities of change. And so this guide is very much around focusing on the net benefits and opportunities alongside looking at the costs and risks of inaction. It's designed to inform the ongoing plans of the Coalition of Finance Ministers to build the capability and capacity of its members. The guide is designed to provide a comprehensive menu of options to help finance ministries mainstream climate action within their economic, fiscal, and financial policy according to their specific national circumstances. It's been very much a major collaborative effort. It's involved over 30 ministries of finance, over 25 partners. It's involved over 30 expert contributions. It's involved a global consultation process with the private, third sector and civil society. It features over 140 examples of leadership by finance ministries globally. And I think is something which has been a real team effort. Next slide, please. This was the slide I originally thought I was focusing on. So just to really give an overview of the story, we know that we're off track in terms of climate, and we know that to reach net zero by mid-century will require a fundamental reorganization of the global economy. So we need to see economic transformation at scale, and this will require significant investment, in particular in 4 key priority areas. The first is investment to transform the major emitting sectors of the economy in energy and buildings, in transport, in industry and agriculture. The second is strengthening adaptive capacity in building resilience, including financing loss and damage. Cutting across all of this is the need to invest in protecting and restoring natural capital, including through sustainable land use and conservation of biodiversity. And finally, investing in a just transition will be fundamental to sustain public support and ensure that it is an effective transition. Next slide, please. In our view, ministries of finance will be absolutely fundamental to unlocking the scale of investment needed. We need to see new investment of the order of an additional 2% of GDP year on year for the next decade and beyond, and between 4 and 5% in developing countries and emerging markets. And it's really that ministries of finance that will be key to unlocking that investment. Finance ministries are centre of government bodies right at the crux of coordinating economic, fiscal and financial policy and mobilising investment. Finance ministries sit right at the heart of shaping their country's economy and national vision for development. Globally, the global family of finance ministries oversee expenditure worth over $30 trillion, over 1/3 of global GDP, and clearly play a major role in shaping the $100 trillion global economy. Finance ministries also act as regulators or shareholders in state-owned enterprises, development banks, sovereign wealth funds, and play a major role in oversight of the financial sector and as shareholders in the MDBs and IFIs. Next slide, please. So really, to summarize, we're off track on climate. This will require a major transformation in the global economy. Finance ministries will be right at the heart of unlocking the investment needed for that. And the final part of what I wanted to talk about was that in our view, climate action will be absolutely essential for finance ministries to achieve their core priorities of macro stability, growth, and responsible management of the public finances. Climate action, as explained in further detail in the guide, can help finance ministries avoid escalating risks with macro critical consequences, can really, second, help unlock significant growth and development benefits while generating cost savings. Unlocking a triple resilience dividend will be enormously important for the economy, society, and environment. And of course, in the current context that we face globally, climate action can help deliver the cheap, secure, and clean energy that we need and help combat inflation. So the benefits and opportunities of action and the costs and risks of inaction really mean that climate action can be the development and growth story of the 21st century. Now I'm going to hand over to Annika, who's going to walk you through in a bit more detail the framework for climate action that we've developed as part of this flagship guide for the Coalition of Finance Ministers. Annika, over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and hello everyone from me. I want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about this Ministry of Finance framework for climate action that really is the centerpiece of the guide. Next slide, please. Yes, so we designed this guide to cover 2 key areas. Firstly, the question of how finance ministries can mainstream climate action into their core functions and responsibilities. And then secondly, how they can build the capabilities they need to deliver on this agenda. And with this in mind, we developed this framework that you can see on the slide here that really aims to support ministries of finance in holistically mainstreaming climate into their core business. And the framework consists of 3 functions, which you can see in the top row based on the responsibilities that a typical finance ministry has. And I say typical because, of course, each finance ministry is slightly different and has slightly different responsibilities, but these should still speak to most finance ministries to some extent. And then in the second row, 3 capabilities that are needed to perform these functions, and then also 1 cross-cutting area. I hear some background noise. I'm wondering, is that me, or is there someone that's there who's perhaps not muted? I'm going to keep talking. So I'm just going to briefly walk you through these 7 elements. So first we have function 1, economic strategy and vision. This is really about how Ministry of Finance can be involved in upstream processes, how they can use this center of government position that Nick mentioned earlier to contribute to national climate strategies, including nationally determined contribution, long-term strategies, adaptation plans, and then also use these plans to inform other national development plans, investment strategies, etc. And of course, in this process, working closely with ministries of environment and any other line ministry that may be involved or in charge of these processes. Then we have function 2, fiscal policy, which is really about implementation then of these plans. So this is about how ministries of finance can use their core responsibility for fiscal policy to implement these strategies. So we talk about the tax aspect, so the importance of fiscal incentives, of subsidy reform, etc., but also about how to use the budget and procurement processes strategically to drive climate action across government. And then function 3 is about finance and financial policies. So how can ministries of finance mobilize different sources of capital, domestic, international, public, private, to make money flow towards the climate transition. And then in the second row, we have the 3 capabilities, kicking off with the leadership capability, which is really about how to ensure that climate action is mainstreamed across operations, across governance, across the institutional setup of a finance ministry. The second capability is about collaboration and coordination, both within government, so really making sure that a Ministry of Finance is part of the whole of government approach to climate action, and of course also beyond with non-government actors. And then we have the human and analytical capability, which is really about having in place the right expertise, staff and skills, training procedures, as well as the economic decision-making tools and data that are needed to drive all of these processes. And then last but not least, in the third row, we have 1 cross-cutting theme, the just transition, because we argue that the just transition really needs to be mainstreamed into all policy design for a transition to be successful. Next slide, please. So in the guide itself, 1 more slide. Okay, go back to the other one. That's not the slide I was expecting, but it's okay. So in the guide, we then deep dive into these functions and capabilities, and what we were supposed to see was actually a list of all the so-called action areas that we cover in the guide that fall under each function and capability, but I'm not going to talk you through those anyways. But yeah, next slide, please. Because instead, I want to talk a little bit about how and what for ministries of finance can use the guide and this framework in practice. And we argue that firstly, the report can really help ministries of finance to grapple with the question of why. So why is their role crucial for climate action? And also, why is climate action so necessary for them to deliver on their core priorities, as Nick mentioned earlier? And then secondly, we hope it can help them figure out the questions of what and how. So how can they use the framework, as they can use the framework to explore in what areas they need to mainstream climate action and how they can strengthen their capabilities to act. And to help them do that, for each of these action areas that we cover, we provide specific guidance and inspiration. For instance, we highlight a number of tools that Ministries of Finance can use and organizations or support providers that can help them navigate these challenges. And of course, we point to action that is already happening in finance ministries around the world that can be used as inspiration. And I will come to that in a second on the next slide. But last but not least, sorry, just can you stay on this slide for a second? Last but not least, we hope that the guide can help finance ministries to figure out where to start or what to do next in terms of climate action. So we have a whole section focused on providing guidance on how to assess progress so far and how to determine priorities and next steps. Next slide, please, now. And yeah, as promised, I want to briefly come back to these case studies because they really are one of the core features of the guide. So we highlight over 140 case studies from around the world that really show that many finance ministries are already taking great steps towards mainstreaming climate action. And of course, we'll very shortly hear from 2 ministries of finance on their work. But before we do that, I just wanted to give a couple more impressions of what is already happening. For instance, we have Denmark, where the Ministry of Finance has actually gone and updated its mission and vision to include climate action as a top-level objective alongside the more traditional finance ministry objectives of like fiscal and economic priorities. We have Jamaica, where the Ministry of Finance was key to developing a state-of-the-art strategy to counter the financial risks of natural disasters that the country is facing. We have in Rwanda, the ministry has been leading the revision of the NDC process, and as part of that, has quantified the investment needs that the country needs to deliver on its climate commitments, which has really helped to mobilize both internal and external funding. And just to name one last example, we have the US, where the Treasury is currently introducing a climate literacy program to ensure that really all staff have the knowledge they need to mainstream climate into their work. But of course, a lot more work is to be done, and the purpose of this guide, we hope, is really to help ministries of finance move faster and further on this agenda. And with that, I want to hand back to Nick.
Great. Final slide, and then we'll turn over to Sanjeev to walk us through the next steps. I mean, just to conclude, I think the coalition, as well as all the partners involved, have learned a lot through the process of developing this guide. First, in our view, the economic argument is not yet won. Much work is still needed on why climate action matters for delivering on the core economic priorities of finance ministries and why the often perceived trade-offs can be managed. There are wide-ranging barriers to action, but in our view, a lot of leadership is already being demonstrated, a lot of barriers are being overcome, and proof points are being forged on the ground. So this will really need all of us to do our part. It will take a coalition of actors with a common vision and goal to drive change, and it's why we've been so excited to work with all members of the Coalition of Finance Ministers to make this guide happen. A big thank you to all of those involved, Finland, Rwanda, the co-chairs of the coalition, the secretariat, and all members and partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick and Annika, for your presentation, which has now set the stage for the panel discussion. Before we start the discussion, let me take a minute to introduce the 5 panelists. Sam Mugumbe Kuju is the Assistant Commissioner at the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development in Uganda. David Owens works on sustainable and climate finance in the Department of Finance of the Republic of Ireland. Carolina Rentira is the chief of a division in IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, which focuses on public financial management issues. And she is also responsible for capacity development in Anglophone Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Central Asia regions. Previously, she was an executive director at the World Bank and Colombia's Minister of Planning. Arturo Herrera Gutierrez is the global director for governance at the World Bank. He has held several senior positions at the bank. Between 2018 and 2021, he held leadership positions in the government of Mexico, including Minister of Finance and Public Credit. Amar Bhattacharya is a senior fellow at Brookings and is a co-author of the recent report prepared under the auspices of the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate Finance. Now, for the audience, please note that you can submit your questions through Twitter at CGDev, #CGDTalks, or email at events@cgddev.org, or on YouTube. These questions will be consolidated by CGD team's event. So I would like to request the panelists to limit their responses to the first question to about 5 minutes. The idea is that we should be able to do 2 rounds of questions. Let me start with the country representatives first. Let me go to Sam. Ugandan Ministry of Finance has wide-ranging responsibilities for managing country's economic and financial policies. Against this background, how is the Ministry of Finance embedding climate actions into its core priorities? Sam. Sam, we seem to have...
I'm okay. I'm audible.
Yeah, we are
Oh,
audible.
glad to be
Yes.
here.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you for organizing this webinar. It's very, very key, and we're happy we're on this call because, like Nick said, we participated a lot in having this guide out, and we're proud that it's out, and we're happy that it's going to help us. But going back to the question directly because of time, yes, as a ministry, we know our mandate, our traditional mandate, like explained by Nick, and the Nathana is one, revenue mobilization, sound economic policies, making sure there's macroeconomic stability and the rest as you know them. But we are very sure and we know and we have evidence that climate change has affected our revenue, is affecting our macroeconomic stability. For example, we realized one of the years, 16-17 financial year, our GDP growth dropped significantly. It was almost comparable to the time when we had COVID. So in other words, as Minister of Finance, we know that climate change is a key factor in what we should do. And therefore, we've come up strongly. We want to be involved strongly, and that's why the guide is very key. But what are we looking at? We are looking at, for one, ensuring when it comes to like macroeconomic stability, we're collecting data to input into our reports that can inform us on how climate change is affecting our economic stability at macroeconomic level. We are involved into getting into budgeting. We have into budget tagging so that we know that climate change, how much money we're putting in climate change. When it comes to revenue, as a country, Minister of Finance will put up a climate change unit that is deliberately helping us to mobilize domestic revenue, but at the same time looking at the global revenue. We are going ahead, we are looking at this disaster risk assessment. So we've put tools to make sure that we inform ourselves and the policies in relation to what we're supposed to do traditionally to make sure we get informed of what climate change is doing. And lastly, so that we as Minister of Finance get involved in adaptation, mitigation, and ensuring that financial flows move towards climate change. This we know because as a ministry, like Nick said, we manage the economy and we come in strongly. However, we also know that traditional as Minister of Finance, we were not into this. And therefore, having the guide and sharing information like we're doing in this webinar is very key to our country. And later on, I hope you will ask me how we are going to use the guide. I hope, let me prompt that question. But this is very important, and our ministry, that's where we are moving. I would like to thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for being precise and to the point. Let me turn now to David. Ireland is believed to have taken steps to strengthen climate capacity of its Ministry of Finance. Are there any lessons for other countries that can be drawn from your experience?
Thanks, Sanjeev, and I'd like to thank the Centre and indeed the coalition colleagues and Nick and Annika in the LSE in Grantham for the chance to participate in this. I'd say we're at early stage, so the mainstreaming of climate considerations across the finance ministries it's really a common challenge for us. And the climate unit in which I work here in Dublin is 2 years old this year. So it's very much an evolving area. And as other colleagues and as the report, I think, brings out, the capacity and skills in finance ministries need to be worked on. Traditionally, our tax colleagues would deal with, say, environmental taxes. Our expenditure colleagues would be looking at agricultural spending. I saw there was just a question there in the box about agricultural subsidies. Very interesting and valid question, I think. And other colleagues deal almost in silos. So climate is the classic externality, but it's dealt with in silos across the different policy areas. So what we've tried to do in the climate unit here is act as a kind of a hub that we can inform the policies as they're being developed by financial services law in the spending side, and particularly with our tax colleagues here in the ministry. So the first thing you have to do as a civil servant is look at the law, and we have a Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, which actually establishes a legally binding framework that we must move towards 51% reduction relative to 2011 levels in emissions, and that has to be reached, or the intention is to reach it by 2030, in line with EU targets, which of course Ireland's EU member operates within the EU legal framework. And then there's a net zero target for 2050. Now that's all underpinned by political governance and an entire framework. So there's 5-year carbon budgets, they've already been set. Ministers have been given their carbon budget limits that they have to reach, emission ceilings that they must work within. Now, these are extremely challenging, and this isn't an easy piece of work in any respect. Another piece that we've done here within the department is we changed our statement of strategy. So it now includes a climate-related strategic objective, and that's to promote environmentally sustainable economic progress. So that's traditionally the primary focus of the department would have been, collecting taxation, and it would have supported climate action through the taxation system. And I think
we seem to have lost David. Maybe we can go to the next panelist, and then we can sort of go back to him for. Let me now turn to international fund. Oh, so you're back. Sorry.
Sorry, I lost connection for a moment. I was speaking, I think, Sanjeev, about our carbon pricing system, which is done through the carbon tax. So the carbon tax was introduced about 2009, and at the time it was.
I think he got cut off again. So why don't we hold him off for the moment and go to the international financial institutions. Let me turn to Carolina. And sorry, I can turn to Carolina. And how is the IMF supporting the agenda set out in the guide? How are you tailoring your capacity building agenda to the needs of climate transition? Because until recently, you were focusing on traditional areas of public financial management. Could you please explain? Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very interesting webinar. So the IMF is strongly supporting the agenda set out by the guide, and we really welcome this product. And as you may be aware, climate change and climate-sensitive public financial management is at the center now of a lot of the IMF work. So last year, the Resilient and Sustainability Trust, the RST, was set up to provide affordable financing to support countries as they tackle the structural challenges related to climate change. The lending facility of this trust, the RSF, provides loans with a 20-year maturity and a 10-year grace period during which no principal is repaid. And about 3/4 of the membership of the IMF have access to these funds. But to access these fundings, countries need to have a package of high-quality policy reforms that make significant progress towards addressing long-term structural challenges of climate change. And the disbursement of the loan is linked to the completion of the RSF reformed measures. So in this sense, we in the IMF and in the Fiscal Affairs Department are developing diagnostic tools and implementation instruments to help countries, and particularly the Ministries of Finance, to build and implement climate finance responses policies and institutions that strengthen the climate sensitivity of the Ministry of Finance. So I will talk a little about the budget and PFM tools functions and the diagnostic tools and capacity development support that we have provided. So there's the tool I want to talk more about is the climate PIMA, the Climate Public Investment Management Assessment. The climate module, the climate PIMA, assesses the institutional readiness and gaps in infrastructure governance against the backdrop of climate change. And this is a tool that is relevant and useful for countries across all levels and all stages of development. So the climate PIMA formulates a set of tailored recommendations based on the findings and a prioritized and sequenced action plan to support the implementation of the most appropriate infrastructure projects for the countries. The findings of the climate PIMA are summarized in a reform plan, and they really help identify how to strengthen public investment and be able to generate public investments that are resilient and that are climate friendly. We have conducted in less than a year and a half 34 climate PIMAs, and these have shown that overall the area where countries are stronger is in the planning phase. The NDC documents have been very useful, and many of them are reflected in the national development plans of the countries. But countries still need to do a lot of work in order to link the planning to the medium-term budget framework, to improve project appraisal and selection, and to take into consideration climate change. So we are developing tools to help countries implement reforms in these areas. In terms of, besides public investment management, we are also working in the whole of greening, what we call the budget or the PFM institutional process. So this is going through all the institutions, the framework system and processes, so that they start to have a climate angle. What we do is work through the existing systems in the countries. We are not advocating for new systems. We are advocating for countries to really strengthen the existing systems with this climate angle. So in this approach, we help countries identify which areas they can intervene first, either because they have stronger institutions or because the gap is larger, and then they can work on their PFM system. And the third area we are working a lot is in relation to climate-related fiscal risks. So not only the risk due to natural disasters, but for countries to understand what are the long-term implications in terms, for example, of fiscal sustainability, of their sustainability of climate change. What does climate change do to growth, and how that affect the fiscal balances? So all of these are to strengthen reform core fiscal policies and institutions. Since the program, how does this link to the Ministry of Finance? And this will be the last part of my answer. So as has been mentioned, green PFM reforms usually bring a big range of stakeholders, including climate and environmental ministries, other line ministries, parliament, supreme audit institutions. But we are, and as has been presented today, are believers that the Ministry of Finance plays a key role in all of this process. And the Ministry of Finance is well organized usually to develop, to support this coordination across ministries. If the Ministry of Finance is not really involved, it's very unlikely that reforms stick and are effective. So there is a big responsibility, not only a possibility, but a responsibility from Ministries of Finance. But we also know that they have challenges, and that implementing reforms is not so easy, as has been already mentioned before. There are lack of methodologies of what governments can do and ministries of finance, so we are working on methodologies for implementation of reforms. There are also, there's not a tight linkage between planning and medium-term fiscal framework and budget, so we are creating how-to notes on how to implement this reform. And there's a big gap in terms of the skills that ministries of finance need. And although many ministries are moving in the direction of strengthening their capacity and understanding of climate challenges, it is also true that the offer of skilled people across the globe is very limited. And this is creating a bottleneck, and we all have to provide support to increase the availability of staff on ministries of finance and in budget departments that have climate knowledge. Finally, there is still some lack of political will. And in that sense, we think that the coalition of ministries for climate action is key to continue promoting this capacity, this message that it all starts and ends with political leadership, and that to implement reforms, ministers of finance have to be in the leading front. So to summarize, we are developing a lot of tools. We are working very closely with the governments. We have supported a number of RSF measures that have, for example, in the case of Rwanda, gone across the public investment system to all the way to green tagging, and that have really created a solid step in the right direction of strengthening the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Let me now turn to Arthur, and I would like to know about World Bank's role in helping countries develop the capacity, particularly in the context of the guidance that has come out of this guide. So, can you please tell us a little bit about the World Bank's programs to strengthen capacity of Ministry of Finance to address climate transition?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Sanjeev. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. So let me actually divide my answer in two parts. The first one is a little bit along the lines of what Carolina was just mentioning, which is the specific aspects of public financial management that need to be fine-tuned within the ministries of finance. So we have been working also on public investment management, but also on issues related, for example, the implications that are for the state of enterprises, asset management, etc. We are also working with them in issues related to financial regulation. But let me actually put those, and one very specific thing, and that's a very welcome novelty, is when some ministries of finance have decided to have, let's say, a green unit within housed by the ministries of finance. So, and one very specific request that we have been receiving recently is how does that unit need to be implemented? What are the levels of coordination that such unit will have within the Ministry of Finance, and what are the implications of having it? But let me actually come back to to make some specific comments about the guide and the presentation by Annika and Nick, and try to be a little bit provocative about it, and also to lay where I think it's probably one of the most potentially successful areas of engagement of the World Bank with the Ministries of Finance. So Nick started by mentioning that there are some sort of an understanding of the cost and risk, and later in his presentation he mentioned that the economic argument is not yet won. I will beg to differ a little bit. I think everybody understands the incredible costs associated with that. But what people are at the Ministries of Finance are afraid are about what are the costs of actually facing this. Not the cost in the long run, but the cost right now. So let me actually make a couple of references to the guidance. That kind of the macro aspect is what in the guidance is in the first function, the economy, strategy, and vision function. Now, there has been a lot of progress in which I may say it falls in the third function, which is countries are issuing green bonds. they are introducing regulation, financial regulation, to allow to ease the firms, the private sector, get access to credit to finance a green transition. There are a lot of progress in budget, green targeting, as it was mentioned by our colleague on the Ministry of Finance of Uganda. But what is missing is the whole gap between those things and the macro aspects. And let me speak specific about it. So Nick mentioned, and I'm gonna quote him exactly what he said. I wrote it down. He said there are need of significant investments, and then he put a general price tag to that. That's 4 to 5%. Now, to get to 4 to 5% of GDP, it will require either budget reallocations of actually actions on the revenue side. I actually find a little bit funny in that sense that each time that Nick was mentioning carbon price taxing or carbon taxing was exactly when he was disconnected just before Carolina, because that's are actually the tough decisions that Minister of Finance need to take, either on the budget or either on the revenue. Now, what I personally think is missing is actually cost. What does implies for the Minister of Finance, that 4 to 5% of GDP. Let me do in just 30 seconds some back of the envelope calculations. Usually when we look any kind of investment in any country, 75% of those investments are done by the private sector. So if we take the lower end of Nick's range, 4%, that means that 3% probably need to come from the private sector. It still will require some treatment, fiscal or financial treatment from the government. But then, for the Ministry of Finance will be something like 1 to 1.5% of GDP. That need to be mapped to exactly actions and also to budget. And that's the costing exercise that we think is missing, and the one in which we want now to move and collaborate with the Ministries of Finance. Thank you, Sanjeev. Let me stop.
Thank you, Arturo. Thank you so much. Let me go back to David before I go to Amar, if it's okay. David,
thanks, Sanjeev. Hopefully I won't be.
I think so. I think there is something flawed in his computer. So let's go to Amar. Amar, I will go to the report that you co-authored with Vera Songwe and Nick Stern, in which you emphasize the need for a major step up in investment and additional finance of about $1 trillion a year to support climate transition in emerging and developing economies other than China. What role do you see for the guide in scaling up of investment and ensuring effective absorption of external financing? What should come first, capacity building or financing, or should they happen concurrently? Amar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Let me first thank you and CGD for hosting this, to the coalition for supporting the guide, and to my colleagues, Nick Godfrey and Annika Heckful, for all the work that they did to put out this guide in collaboration with the members of the coalition. I do think it's a very important product, and it's one that will continue. We will continue to learn and will evolve. So I'll begin by building on the comments, starting with what Nick said, that we are at a really critical moment in time, because the window for action is shrinking very rapidly, and the costs of climate change are here and evident. And the response that is necessary at this point in time, as Nick said, and Arturo also was underscoring, is an investment imperative. An investment imperative to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy, an investment imperative to adapt to a world of climate change, and an investment imperative to protect and restore natural capital. And also we need investment, or we need financing to finance a just transition, as Nick mentioned. The numbers that we put out in the report you mentioned was 2.4 trillion per year by 2030, And we posit that about 1.4 trillion of that can come from domestic sources, and about we posit that 1 trillion will need to come from external sources, public and private. Now, the scale of investment is challenging but feasible. And as Vasita pointed out, this is not just about climate, it is absolutely centrally about sustainable growth and development. So it's an investment, and that investment has to be financed, and that investment has to be sound, as you suggested, Sanjeev. So what does that mean? In terms of the guide, it means that finance ministers have to really play a key role in ensuring that in long-term strategies, in NDCs, in national development planning, we are incorporating this aspect of now investment and transformation very crucially, that finance ministries are taking a lead role in translating that into investment programs, recognizing what the implications are. And as Arturo said, a very large part of this will be private, but not a majority, because we have to remember the composition of this investment. The composition of the investment is transforming major emitting sectors, which will be largely private. It will be adaptation and resilience, which today is predominantly public. There's scope for increasing private investment. And then there is natural capital, where again, it is predominantly today public. So when you add it up, at least 50% or more will be private, and about 50%, let's say, is public. So in order to get this investment going, we need the policy and institutional framework. And as Carolina mentioned, public investment management is absolutely central, but not in the traditional way of a project at a time. It has to take the approach of system transformation. It has to say, what are the system goals that we are trying to achieve? And within that, how does the public investment framework fit? So yes, it is, every project has to be sound, but it is now much more than a project by project approach. That's a very important implication in terms of the change that has to happen. Second, although the private sector will play a lead role, the institutional framework as well as the policy framework for that will be absolutely crucial. And at two levels. One is, the macro types of policies, both in terms of, the macroeconomic framework to allow for a sound investment environment, but also carbon pricing, fossil fuel subsidies, agricultural subsidies, and the like, that determine the general framework, but also specific policies that relate to that investment, such as offtake risk, creditworthiness of utilities, and the framework, for example, on investment in natural capital. The other part that will be very crucial is institutional capacity for actually translating investment programs into concrete programs, pipelines of projects, what we call pipeline development, and finally, the structure of financing. So the public financing framework, of course, is crucial, but for the private financing, a key issue in emerging markets and developing countries is the cost of capital. And that has to be tackled, and that has to be tackled by sharing, managing, and reducing risk, but also through the judicious use of blended finance. So all of these are complex issues. What comes first? Well, ultimately, the challenge we are facing is scale and pace are absolutely essential. But if we do not get the soundness of investment, we are creating, not solving a problem. So capacity building, as you suggest, is absolutely crucial. The role of IFIs, the IMF, as Carolina was mentioning, through the RST and through other mechanisms, the role of the World Bank, as Arturo was mentioning, of the MDB system as a whole will be crucial. But there is one innovation that is being put forward that is particularly relevant, and that is country sector platforms. And the idea is to put together structures that allow us to come behind a purposeful strategy, bringing all stakeholders together to basically set direction, to tackle binding constraints and mobilize the financing that is necessary. And the MDBs are now working on this in a very systematic way, and that really is very encouraging. The so-called just energy transition programs, of which Indonesia is an example, is also a mechanism for that kind of acceleration that we are talking about.
Thank you, Amar.
Sanjeev.
I would like to go back to David, assuming that his Wi-Fi holds up. David, I mean, there's a lot of interest from all of us about Ireland's experience. And then also, if you can also, as you are talking about carbon pricing, can you also discuss a little bit the question that was posed by one of the audience members, which is that how can Ministry of Finance aligning their agricultural subsidies with the climate transition? I would extend that further to even energy subsidies, which have actually gone up a lot in Europe in the last 1 or 2 years. Perhaps you can allude to these things.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjeev. I hope this holds up. So on the carbon tax, I think it's very important. We've programmed the carbon tax forward to 2030. So the carbon tax came in a very low rate, about 10 euros a ton. It's going to go up to 100 euro a ton by 2030. And at the moment, it's about 50 euro a ton. So it's gone on, it's been pre-programmed. So it kind of takes the temptation to interfere with the carbon tax away if it's just simply there and in the law already. And we use the increases in carbon tax for climate action. So it's hypothecated. It goes on climate actions here within Ireland. On the question about agricultural subsidies, it's quite an interesting one. It's very topical. Yesterday in Strasbourg, the nature restoration law was managed to pass the European Parliament, very close vote. And what it is really about is restoring nature, which obviously involves the landowners, which very often are farmers. And it's a controversial area. But it's clear that the subsidies will need to line up now alongside things like nature restoration. So here in Ireland, we have pilot projects to re-wet peatlands and so on in order to sequester more carbon. That costs money, and as Arturo has said, there's big investment needs here. But I think it's recognized that the environment is to protect the environment is going to need those investments to increase both public and private. We want to crowd in private sector investment into this as well. The public sector and the state purse can't pick up all of these costs. I'd also mention maybe just the green bonds. I think people have spoken about green bonds there. It's clear there's a greenium, as they say, for green bonds. There's an investment market out there for it. This year in January, Ireland issued a sovereign green bond, and we hoped to raise about 3 billion euro. It was oversubscribed 10 times, and we raised about 3.5 billion, which is probably close to half of our overall borrowing requirement for the year. Now, that green bond has to be allocated for green purposes. It has to be third-party validated and explained exactly what we're using the money for. So, there's, as I say, there's an investment appetite out there. There is the clear need, and there are the projects are there, and we are moving the agricultural subsidies slowly, I think, but generally are moving in that environmental way, all within the ambit of the laws which the government has brought in, and indeed the strategy which has been set out here within the ministry. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Let me now go to the second round of questions. We have less time now for the second round, but perhaps the panelists could limit their answers to 3 minutes. And that way we can go through all the panelists and also have some concluding remarks from one of the coalition of finance ministers members. So let me start with Sam. And so how will Uganda use the guide to accelerate climate action? And what are your ministry's top 3 priorities? Do you need any support for international financial institutions to drive climate agenda forward? You heard both the World Bank and the IMF laying out what they are doing. Do you need their support for climate transition? Sam.
Oh, thank you so much, Sanjeev. This is a good question. I'll start it from the last part. Yes, we need support from our development partners because this is a new area that we're going in as Ministries of Finance, coming off from our traditional role and knowing how important it's for us in terms of both planning, budgeting, and ensuring that we put their money in the right way. So IMF and World Bank and others, we need you. But we've been working a lot with both of the two, IMF and World Bank, and also others that have not gone to list here, especially when it comes to making sure we understand how we're using our natural capital in terms of flows and stocks, natural capital accounting, World Bank. Also helping us to embed climate change in our key reports that inform our policies and inform us where we put our money in terms of fiscal policy management. The macroeconomic reports we are putting in climate change, we are producing adjusted macroeconomic indicators reports. We are soon looking at the fiscal risks of climate change, macroeconomic risks.
We seem to have lost Sam.
Am I on?
Oh, okay, good.
Oh, sorry, you lost me. I was telling you how we are working with our development partners, IMF and World Bank, and we're going to work on the CCDRI with World Bank, with IMF. We have a mission. They're coming to us in the next 2-3 weeks. We're going to look at the fiscal risk assessment. So we need each other. But the guide itself, how are we going to use it as Minister of Staff? One, the guide is very clear and it's very elaborate. For now, yes, it is. And I'm sure we are going to keep updating it over time. But one, it gives us confidence in terms of the different directorates of the ministry and departments. For example, we know what budget department is supposed to do. We know what economic affairs director is supposed to. So there's confidence. Things that we thought we are doing out of our own, now these come in our report. And it will help us to advocate for more involvement of all the departments in Ministry of Finance to ensure that we get more involved in climate change action, planning and budgeting. We do have a tripartite agreement with the Ministry of Water, which is the lead agency in climate change, and National Planning Authority and ours. So we know this is going to help us. Also, the guide is going to help us to mobilize resources for the necessary capacity building of traditional economists and statisticians that we have in Ministry of Finance. So it's a guide that is going to help us do our work, and we will definitely come to many partners to see how we cascade it to the different areas. And lastly, this guide is going to be helpful in mainstreaming climate change in the entire Ministry of Finance, but also moving it to other departments and ministries and come up with what we talk about most, the whole government approach. So I'd like to thank you, and that's that. That's my submission.
Thank you. David, I was planning to come back to you, but you already laid out your answer on carbon pricing. But in a minute, is there any lesson that one can draw from your experience with carbon pricing for other countries, both advanced and developing? As you can see, there's a lot of resistance to using this policy for climate transition. What are the lessons from your experience that others can learn from?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjeev. I think it's very important that the proceeds from the carbon tax are spent on climate actions. I think that really improves the acceptability of it to the public and indeed to other government members. Here in Ireland at the moment, we have a three-party coalition. One of the parties happens to be the Green Party, and I think that was definitely important in their considerations and their input into the programme for government. Also, it provides some certainty to business that they can see that the carbon tax will increase in steps out to 2030. So it's possible to budget and to make estimates out into the future. So I think that certainty is very important. And as I say, using the proceeds for climate action has improved its acceptability.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me go to Carolina. Carolina, you have about 2-3 minutes to respond. Now, the IMF has recently launched, last year actually, the new facility, RSF facility, to support climate transition and pandemic preparedness. So, but 10 countries so far have been approved by the board for this facility. But many of those countries that have received assistance from the fund have not received CPMA that you talked about earlier. And so when you look at the measures that countries are implementing for climate transition, they are not strong enough, in part because they haven't benefited from adequate diagnostics from the bank or the fund. I wrote some pieces on this RSF facility. So how can one ensure that all countries that seek that facility benefit from appropriate diagnostics, either from you or from the World Bank?
Thank you, Sanjeev. This is a very important question because when I first talked, I talked about the need for Ministries of Finance to increase and improve the skills of their officials in terms of climate. And same thing happened for us in the IMF and the World Bank and all other international financial institutions. For us to be able to provide a good service to our member countries, we really need to increase our capacity and our understanding. And I would say that has been one of the measures that the fund has taken in the last 2 to 3 years, which is really bringing expertise in climate, very strong expertise, cutting-edge expertise to an institution that before didn't have anything in this area, and that was very focused on just on the macro. And now we see climate as part of the macro sustainability and the fiscal sustainability. So these people, new people, plus all the wonderful staff in the country teams, in the area departments, in the functional departments, we are all focused on climate. And we are creating and increasing the amount of diagnostic tools and the type of diagnostic tools that we can help, that we can implement with member countries for them to identify stronger reform measures. So in addition to the PIMA and the Green PFM and the fiscal risks that I already mentioned, there are other tools that are less, let's say, public financial management oriented. One is the Climate Macroeconomic Assessment Program, the CMAP. And this is an assessment of climate policies, including mitigation, adaptation, financing strategies, risk management, and also PFM reforms. This has been mentioned before. This deals with the financing, very important, very large needs, very important area because we need to bring the private sector. So understanding how the countries are setting their institutions to develop these types of reforms. Also, we have the CPAT, the Climate Policy Assessment Tool, that allows estimating the effects of climate mitigation policies, like what has been discussed a lot today, carbon pricing, fossil subsidy reform, and what is their impact on the greenhouse emissions. And we are also working and using a lot the Country Climate and Development Report, the CCDR, prepared by the World Bank. I think this has shown the importance of us, international institutions, to work closer together, coordinate better, understand what the others are doing so that we don't duplicate. We don't have time to duplicate. We have to add. Everything has to be additional. And I think we are all learning a lot about the UN and a lot about the regional financial institutions, and between all of us, we have diagnostic tools, and the fund is using the results of those diagnostic tools for the RSF program. So it's a very interesting, let's say, ecosystem in which the different tools from other institutions, diagnostic tools, help us design reform programs that are strong, that will have an impact, and that are strong enough to be able to get the resources. And this, finally, the point and I stress a lot to my team is, this is an opportunity to use climate to strengthen the basic public financial management systems, because there's so much focus on climate, and climate is about targeting resources. It has been mentioned, the money received has to go to climate. That means we need a good tagging system. We need a good selection process. We need, as was mentioned, a systemic approach to public investment that has SOEs, nationals, and central government. So now we have an opportunity to use this need to strengthen the basic PFM. And I see it as a win-win situation. And I think those diagnostic measures for climate should be part of this bigger framework that we are supporting countries to develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Arturo, you've been in public financial management area for a long time at the World Bank. You've seen a lot of the countries. So do you see this capacity building needs of countries varying across regions at the World Bank, since you oversee the network in your institution? Are those differences captured in the guide, or are we basically talking about the same model globally?
So thank you, Sanjeev. So yeah, let me actually pick up on your last phrase. We have to be careful not to use the same model, right? I mean, I think both IMF and the World Bank have moved a long time ago from this idea that there was just one single best practice that each country needs to be implemented. Now we are much more aware of the difference in the stage of development of each country and what poses different challenges. But also the specific needs of the countries are different. Countries which are low emitters have more needs that are, I would say, around issues related to adaptation or mitigation, but countries that have a different kind of profile. So there are two specific aspects that I would like to mention related to this. One is we really need to understand where is the capacity challenge. And let me use an example of budget. There are countries which are still setting the basic budget systems and trying to understand the implications of that for macro and data stability. And we work them on helping to do that as fast as possible. There are some other countries which are much more sophisticated and are using, I would say, intertemporal budgeting approaches, medium-term fiscal frameworks, etc. And there are some other countries that, for example, are almost working with a performance budgeting kind of approach. So it's very important to understand which countries lie on this. The second aspect of this is that countries tend to look to what their peers are doing, and also tend to look to what countries that are a little bit more advanced to them were doing, to see how they are in sorts of on a timeline. And this is where things are going to get tricky when we talk about climate change. Because yes, countries are going to try to find out what their peers are doing, but it's going to be much more difficult to, let's say, imitate what some of the advanced economies are doing. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, as critical as it is, as important it is for climate change, it involves a high level of green subsidies, which is good, by the way. I love it. But not many countries are going to have that fiscal space to do it. So it's really important in that sense to really tailor to around 2 or 3 different kind of categories. What countries need to do, and to focus the capacity building according to that. I think that the guide is picking up of that, but it really needs to be taking at heart to make it successful. Let me stop here, Sandeep.
Thank you, Arturo. I think this provides a segue to my question for Amar, because it's very much linked to what I was going to ask him. If you look at today's Financial Times, there's a very big piece on the subsidies being given for energy in US and Europe. So which means that the general reluctance to go for any form of carbon pricing. So Amar, here, as I said, there is reluctance to use carbon pricing in advanced economies. And as Arturo mentioned, the US Inflation Reduction Act is likely to significantly change the policy landscape further. But as Arturo said, this is possible in advanced economies where there's fiscal space, where their ratings are not affected if they borrow more, and they are less concerned about rising debt to GDP ratios. But what does it mean for the developing countries? What lessons can one draw for them?
So on the carbon pricing point, we are seeing kind of parallel developments. One development is that there's this push for carbon border price adjustments, where we are in the business of comparing carbon prices across jurisdictions, whether they are explicit carbon pricing or implicit carbon pricing. There's also an effort now to establish a climate club, so that we can compare in some sense across countries, and whether there's a level playing field. And then there is this more subsidy and investment promotion approach, which is being taken through the IRA and its equivalent in Europe. So for developing countries, what does that mean? Well, if you go to Egypt and you look at green hydrogen projects, they are stranded right now because you can't get any electrolyzers. So there's already been a disruption in supply chains because of this policy. It's certainly going to be very difficult for emerging markets and developing countries to compete. If the technology is held back and not shared, that would be quite damaging to the global transformation everywhere. And particularly, there is a worry that finance will be crowded out. So I do think that we need to look at these regimes in a more balanced way, and that the US needs to think about an IRA equivalent in the global setup as it does in its domestic setup. That's the only way in which we will create a level playing field for the developing world.
Thank you, Amar. That's a good point. And perhaps this is an area which the Coalition of Finance Ministers could work on in its next report. Now, so we have had 2 rounds of questions, and we also picked up some questions from the audience. Let me now turn to Pekka Moran to close the event. Pekka is a special representative of the Finnish Finance Minister on climate action. So, Pekka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I cannot see myself in the screen, but please give a sign if you can hear me.
Yes, you can.
Okay. I would just like to, of course, thank you for a very, very rich discussion, and it's really good to see that the discussion is evolving, and that's exactly one purpose of the guide, to do that. But now, after having worked on this intensively exactly now 5 years since we started the coalition. And the guide, why the guide was actually produced, it's really a fundamental issue on what we do. And the idea was there from the start, but to get it going, I think the reasons have quite clearly been presented in this discussion. But firstly, let me just say that this is a systemic change, and it's a long-term effort, even if we know there is urgency. But we also have to be very realistic. As David said, it's really early days. We see rapid development, evolution now happening, but it will take time, and it's early days. And situation in the finance ministries, it's not very rosy. I have to say this. We have heard country cases, and we have 140 of them, and they are encouraging. We need those country cases to encourage further progress, but there is a lack of understanding. For example, in my own country, we have very ambitious climate objectives, 2035 net zero objective. But the fact is that we don't actually know what the fiscal impacts, macroeconomic impacts, how to actually finance all this. So we need to be very alert, and there's also a lot of nervousness on this, and it kind of goes hard to the policy making, and that's the fact of life, and that's what we need to be working on. And the second point is that yes, finance ministries need to take a more role and ownership, but they cannot do that. That mandate needs to be given to them. And in most of the countries, this is just simply not the situation. Finance ministries don't have a lead role. That's the mainstream right now. So that's why we need to really think about the how to get the action going, how to implement this guide. And I would like to make 5 points on that. Country ownership, of course, is really important. Raise awareness. This is what we have done today. General awareness of all policymakers, all the way to the president's offices, all the way to the institutional partners who advise countries, all the way to the research partners who initiate research projects to support all these. Then technical assistance programs, training, that's absolutely critical. That's where IMF, World Bank, and the others play an important role. There are many institutional partners who will support that. Research networks, and that's kind of a national level issue, but it's also a regional issue. So we need mandates, we need expertise, we need capacity. But lastly, let me comment on your point on carbon pricing. I want to share, because this is about sharing experiences. I want to building on what Amar was just saying. I think that was really well put. But Finland was the first country in 1990 to introduce the carbon tax. Why did we do that? Before that, carbon emissions were raising in hand with the economic growth. With this reform and related reforms, it was not only this reform, but really changing regime on how we actually react to environmental problems. We actually were able to create growth and at the same time reduce emissions. So there was a systemic change. It happened in other Nordic countries in parallel. And to do that, it was part of a comprehensive package of issues. So it's not only one-off carbon price, carbon tax, or similar. It's really also about thinking about the overall tax burden. It doesn't have to increase. It's about thinking about revenues and mitigation objectives, the comprehensive approach in the context of economic, fiscal, and financial policies. That's what the guide is all about. So carbon pricing is one part, and it is possible to implement these kind of changes as many, for example, Nordic countries and others have done. So this is I would say a very positive experience from that region. But I would just like to thank. There is a lot of work to do, and we don't want this guide to be just another book in the bookshelf. We want it to be really implemented, and that's what is the big challenge now, and we need your support on it. But thank you very much for this event, and thanks for Nick and Annika for presenting, and all the colleagues sharing their experiences. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Pekka, for your remarks. Before closing the seminar, I would like to just say that one of the key things that comes out from today's discussion is, of course, we need to incorporate climate transition in macroeconomic policies, and ministries of finance are best equipped to do that. But they also need financing. And here, the point that was made by Amar is very valid. Could there be an appetite for something like a IRA for the developing countries? And if so, who is going to finance that? And what would be the role of the international institutions in this regard? The money which is coming from the IMF, from the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, it's not going to be enough. And so far, 10 countries have availed of it. And the issue remains whether many more will step in. And the amount of money there is limited to a certain portion of quota or $1 billion SDRs per country. So the money is not that much. So there is need to tap resources. I think along with incorporating climate policies into different policies, we also need resources to be able to go to net zero goal by 2050. I would also like to thank all the panelists for taking the time. Almost all of them are extremely busy with their jobs, and they took the time, and also were very careful in sticking to the time limit so that we could complete the discussion in the allotted time. So thank you once again, and goodbye.